Those of you who are joining us on YouTube. I um I feel like this is a one of those messages where I've been steered and directed. I will explain. Um and one of the reasons why I am a little bit nervous, and you guys know, you guys can always tell when Q's got something on his mind, right? Um is because the actual weather directed me in this, and that I was musing upon some thoughts this week, but I never really moved into the realm of actually feeling like I had confirmation on a message until something interesting happened. So this weekend is, of course, the last weekend of August. Well, almost the last weekend of August. So one of the few warm camping weekends. And so I thought, we'll we'll go camping and then, pick up the torch again on the next Shabbat, and everybody can have a personal Shabbat and go and find their place with the intensification of all power in the universe and themselves, and whatever that means to them, how they connect with that. However, as I began to observe the weather this week, I found that it was kind of nasty. And I was thinking, well, I wonder if this is going to continue into the Sabbath. And so I started to look at the weather, and I had three or four different locations that were geographically separate from each other by a significant amount of miles, but also different terrain, different ecosystems. So desert camping, mountain camping, and maybe an in-between camping, and found nothing to really be ideal. And then I just said, well, let me just check the weather in this one spot. Maybe we can make it work. And it was literally Thursday night thunderstorms, Friday morning thunderstorms, Friday afternoon thunderstorms, Friday night thunderstorms, Saturday, same thing, same thing, same thing, all the way to Sunday. And then Monday, it actually is nice, right? So I was like, wow, that's weird because I don't really have a confirmed message. So I decided to send a text saying that I was going to cancel camping and we were going to have services and we'll just see what happens. And I didn't hit send. So for 2 days, it just sat there, and I was thinking to myself, man, something doesn't feel right. I don't know what it is. And all of a sudden I turned around and realized I had not sent the message to the congregation saying that we were going to have services. And at that moment, something hit me. I hit send, and all of a sudden something hit me. And I began to think upon it and realized the whole week had been giving me information. I had been pulling in information and realizing that this was a very, very important message. So the weather literally directed my path at this point, which is kind of intriguing to say the least. So I'm excited about this message. Also very nervous about this message. So let's get into it. The first thing that we need to do is we need to do some recapping, but we're going to do some really interesting recapping. First and foremost, let's say that what we thought we understood about Scripture, we don't. And when I say Scripture, let me say this. I'm speaking as a Christian who calls the entire 66 book Protestant canon Scripture, when that's really actually not Scripture. So when I say Scripture, what I'm saying is what a Christian would say is the actual Scripture is all of the books, right? So I guess a better way to put it would be the Bible, right? This compendium that was compiled over, 600 years. That is, we're not looking at it correctly. We're not understanding it correctly. We're not we're not accepting the information that is being given to us correctly. For example, Tanakh, the law, the prophets, and the writings, which is the containment of what the heretic Marcion called the Old Testament, based upon a belief that there was an evil, malicious, malignant God in the Old Testament, creating, directing, wrathing, etc. And there was this actual true creator God in the New Testament that kind of set everything right, because this evil demiurge had screwed everything up. And that's where we get Old and New Testament, is quite literally that there were two gods. And we say it all the time, New Testament, Old Testament. But that's not my message. Christians believe that the Old Testament is a suggestion and not necessarily a mandated process. Okay. Then they go in the, excuse me. Then they go into the New Testament and they say, oh, this is actually what we're supposed to follow. Here's Paul's writings, and we understand them, and we're actually, but not a human who is in modern day American Protestant Christianity is going to understand Paul's writings, because he was a rabbi. He's speaking to Jews. You say, oh, well, what about like the Romans? No, actually, he was writing to Roman Pharisees. How do we know? Because he used the word brethren, which was their code word among themselves. You say, oh, wait a minute. I thought he was talking to the brethren in the church. Nope. Sorry. How's he going to tell somebody, don't let anybody judge you in new moon and Sabbath? He didn't say, don't let anybody judge you in ancient pagan festival that you've converted into a modern day Christian holiday. He said, don't let anybody judge you in new moon and Sabbath. Who's he writing to? Sabbath keepers, new moon observers, right? Don't let anybody who's what? Who's outside of that belief system judge you, to condemn you, to say that, oh, you shouldn't be keeping the Saturday Sabbath. Paul knew what was coming, right? Peter says people actually will do this. They will take Paul's writings, they will convert them into their own understanding, and to a fault will what? Violate Torah. Why is this so important? Because if we're going to actually be the change that this world needs, we need a different view. We need a different worldview. We need a different understanding. We need a different philosophy. We can't go with what we've been given, because take, for example, our blessed King Jimmy, right? He says, I'm going to give the world the Bible in English. No, you're not. You're going to interpret it so that you, as a king, benefit from the serfs and the fiefdom that was already in place, that made you have a kingdom in the first place. Lords and peasants. And you wanted to give a Bible to the people that would cause them to believe that they could be peasants and still be happy, because when they die, they're actually going to have a benefit. Storing up treasures in heaven and not on earth. That sentiment carries over into the Catholic Church as well, where we have that same exact influence from the Pope. Look at the opportunity for the people to pay for the admission out of purgatory into heaven for their loved ones and for themselves, which just so happen to also fund the Sistine Chapel. Kingdom, right? Earthly kingdom. And yet Yeshua says the kingdom of heaven is within you. So do we really understand the kingdom of heaven? No, definitely not. Definitely not. Why is this so important? Because I think it's going to require some humility and some open-mindedness to move away from what we have been taught and known. So let me recap for you. There's a message I preach. I used to preach. Man, I don't even like that word preach, but there's a message that I spoke in 2021, sitting in my living room with my family sitting on the couch, with me sitting at the desk that's in the living room, with my tablet and my tablet camera and my tablet microphones as the medium by which I communicated these things to just the congregation via a private broadcast on Zoom, which was recorded, and a link was present in the ministry network so that you could go click on it and watch that video. It's not on YouTube. In which I taught what the 6 childhood needs are, and I taught what it says when from childhood man is evil continually, right? And I specifically showed that it was actually the imaginations of man that were evil and violence continually, and what it actually meant. And one of the things that we established and understood is that it was the drawing of a human head and a twisted rope, which I'll archive here in a minute, document so that you know what to take notes on. But the premise is that it was a human head and a twisted rope, and it literally meant human twists or human distorts or human alters. That's the word evil. Now, if we accept malevolence as the word evil and connect the two, we have a problem, because I think every single human being that's present today can safely say that what they have experienced as evil is usually a malevolent human being. Perhaps maybe we have created a information system within ourselves, a reference system by which we believe is evil. Perhaps it was a stepfather. Perhaps it was Hitler. Perhaps it was Dahmer. Or for people in my generation, perhaps it was Bundy. But however we do it, we assign malevolence to evil. And that was a mistake. Because why? Because we kind of figured out that the human head twisting something is actually the inappropriate use of the imagination to alter the reality perception of the human being. You can reference my Renewing Your Mind series to really understand that better. And we're still working through that. So if you get to a point where you're like, oh, hey, where's the rest? We're still making them. And I will tell you the reason why that's delayed really quick. The reason why that's delayed is because, number one, I need to be able to walk out what I'm teaching. And if I can't walk it out, then I don't want to teach it. And the Renewing Your Mind series is requiring me to readjust my brain significantly, to change how I think, to change how I perceive emotions, how I perceive reality coming in. So part of it is also me believing that I can walk out what I am receiving as information to give to you. Now, the reason why this is so important is because when we are talking about the mind, and we are talking about the presence of the reality of the mind, one of the things that we need to be cautious about is the context or the concept of when we're right and when we think that we are right. I wanted so bad to go camping this week. I was like thinking, man, can we get up there? I was looking at like the lull of the storms, right? And I was like, can we get up there in between these 2 radar spots and get set up? And then that storm will hit, we'll hide in the tent, and then that storm will go away. And then we can go about our activities until the next storm hits. And there was just this, all of a sudden, this moment when I was like, dude, just don't go, right? Okay, so when we're talking about the twisting, we're talking about an alteration of reality through the use of imagination, which consequently is that Hebrew word machashavet, which we will talk about. When he says, I know the plans I have for you, that's machashavet, right? In Jeremiah, and I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you, right? Not to harm you, et cetera, plans for peace, right? That is machashavet, and that is the word that's used in that verse in Genesis 8 where it says the mind of man really is what it's saying there. The mind of man is evil and violence continually. Well, I think it's important that while we're addressing this, we'll go ahead and put it on board here in a minute, but while we're addressing this, we realize that the information that we have been given is not necessarily the information that is contained. Again, this is just recap, okay? And I'm going to try to not have this be long, but there are a lot of things that we need to cover and understand. So that's the first thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and we will switch over to the board and start to document some things. And so when we are going through this, I think one of the more important elements is to kind of have a open mind. But also, I think that we need to be careful to understand that we've been given information over time that has been building up to something very important. So we'll start with this word raw, which of course, I know that there's a lot that we could go through with this, but in its simplicity, eventually we're just going to arrive at that it is actually the human head. By the way, that's not anybody's likeness in case you think that it is. The human head and a twisted rope. And that is the word in English for evil. Okay? But in the Hebrew, we've got head or man twists. Well, that's our word that's being translated as evil, calamity, etc., right? Isaiah 45:7, I, the Lord, create evil, right? Job chapter 2 says, shall we not receive raw and tov? Shall we not receive evil and good? In other words, shall we accept or be in awareness of our twisted heads? Because he's talking to his wife, right? Think about this. Think about what he's actually saying to his wife. What's Job saying? He says, you speak as an unwise woman. Why did he say as an unwise woman? Because she was wise, right? But he says, you speak as an unwise woman. Shall we not receive evil from the Lord and also good? Right? Or good from the Lord and also evil? But the truth is what he's saying there is, should we not, you need to be aware of how you're twisting it in your mind. You're telling me to curse God and die, and you don't realize the bigger picture here, right? And then he says that we need to receive good and that, right? We need to accept where we're at. That's that idea of receiving the evil. Because remember, I, the Lord, create. I, the Lord, create the head that twists, right? I create the twisted reality. Why would he do that? That's another message. But the premise is that what I'm trying to show you is that when we are working with the mind, it's either going to be in a state of twisting things, or it's going to be strong against the wiles of the devil, which we will consequently somewhat address today. And I'm not going to pull any punches. I'm not going to explain to you why I believe some of the things that I'm going to state today, because we've already spoken on this. Now, this specific thing, like I said, is archived. It's not in the YouTube channel. And we may someday post that. I would probably have to clean up the sound a lot or something. But the premise is that this is one of the things we discovered, is that if it was from childhood, then it was these realities that were twisted from childhood, these beliefs, these wounds, these entitlements and these limiting beliefs, right? Okay, but then we started to get into the thought process that those things, right, had a counterpart. And that's where the Torah cycle began this year. This year was actually the first time that we actually encountered a change in paradigm. I love Jeff Benner's work, and I love his honesty and his humility. And so when I use the ancient Hebrew lexicon of the Bible to teach, I'm not doing that lightly. I believe in what he does and says, but there's a limitation in his book where he just puts a question mark when he doesn't know why the ancient pictographic Hebrew says what it says. Well, we determined that that's probably not, as we want to go further. We want to look at the pictographs and understand the connection between the meaning and the drawing. And so I was basically kind of in this state of looking at the word for light, which is or, which we'll put up on the board now. Here is our word for light, right? It's the Aleph, Vav, and Resh, and literally comes down to the parent root, which is the ox's head, right? And the human head. And remember, we kind of had this discovery that, and so this is the word for light. We'll just put this as light up. Actually, let me label it the same as I did evil, but on the other side. So this is light, right? And we will look at that context or that concept of there being a, instead of head twists, we've got strong head, right? And so then we started to talk about what it meant to be strong-headed, but then we also understood that that was what when it was interpreted into English, was given the word light, and we tried to make a connection. We tried to understand how photon activity played a role in our strong head. And there was a point in time, I will admit, and you guys didn't witness this on YouTube because it was during a midrash, and consequently, eventually we will get our midrash onto YouTube. It'll be probably behind like a Patreon gate or something. But the premise is that eventually I would like you out there to be able to come on stage and ask me questions during the midrash, which is a discussion we have after I stand up here for 2 hours and ramble on. We sit down together as a congregation on Zoom and we consume this stuff. We eat it and we kind of ruminate it and we try to speculate with it. We really kind of get out there, but the reason we do is because that's where the learning occurs. So the premise is that in our focus and understanding of the word light, we are experiencing kind of an ideal that doesn't really make sense. And that is, in the beginning was a strong mind, right? Because why? And God said, let there be a strong mind. And he determined that the strong mind was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. And we know that darkness, the word darkness, which is choshech in the Hebrew, happens to also double as a word for, we're going to mention the Greek word here really quick, chaos. Let's go ahead and let's reassign it as order. Disorder, okay? In other words, there's natural order processes that occur in the universe. There are natural laws, we'll call them, as what the scientists have called them, but there's processes like photosynthesis and glucolysis, right? That keep us alive, that cause the universe to exist. There's vibration, frequency, and energy that all cause the universe to exist. However, these universal laws work because we do have a group of people saying that gravity doesn't even exist. And okay, I will just allow them to do their thing, and we'll allow these guys who believe that gravity exists to do their thing. And I'm sure eventually the answer will present itself. But the concept or the idea is that as we began to explore this, we realized that darkness was a disorder and that light was not the opposite of darkness, but that darkness was just an absence of the light. So darkness is an absence of a strong mind. Well, the absence of the strong mind doesn't necessarily equate to evil, does it? The absence of a strong mind doesn't mean you're twisting, right? It doesn't mean you're twisting. So there's kind of something in between, and we haven't yet discovered what that is. But I can tell you that it has something to do with the kingdom of the earth versus the kingdom of the heavens. Now, in all of this, what we discovered here was the standard unhealthy human process and the higher self, self-actualized, self-validated person. And we also discovered that Yeshua was made to be sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. He made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God, that there was no merit to our title because of what had happened. We could not add nor take away from it, which meant that this had something to do with meritlessness. And so as we discovered these things, there was a point where we were sitting in the Midrash and I said, guys, we're not getting anywhere today. I want to shut it down. And the reason I do is because I believe the rest will be revealed as we go, as we start to apply this filter to our studies. Because all of a sudden light becomes something else. Darkness becomes something else. Death becomes something else, right? Life becomes something else. So when we are looking at these things, then we were starting to try to understand how they played a role in everything that was going on. And we realized that Israel did what was right in their own eyes, and that resulted in the cycle of Israel. Doing what's right in your own eyes is actually a twisting of the head. I'm sorry, a twisting of reality using the head, the mechashavet, the imagination. Now we have the imagination mini series as part of the Renewing Your Mind series that we're going through, and then we're going to start to look at how that imagination constructs things and then creates realities. And when we start to get into the idea of magnetic attraction that we find in induction and that we find in Michael Faraday's theories, we will realize how much that affects us as we allow our minds to try to twist reality. I want you to notice the passiveness versus the assertiveness of these two. Mind alters, strength alters. Okay, so strength alters mind, or mind alters reality. Okay, that's the premise there. And we're going to get into that a little bit. So the reason why this is important is because when we began this Torah cycle, all of a sudden, the pictographs that have the question mark next to them now have a very big question for me. Why did they use these letters? And just accepting the letters for what they mean. Take it, for example, the word unclean. The word unclean does not mean unclean. Why? I will show you why really quick. This is just more recap, right? So the word unclean is actually going to be a tet, right? Let's go with a vav, a mim, and an aleph. And that is the Hebrew word Tomeh. Okay, Tomeh. But what's powerful is when we drop these suffixes and infixes, we will arrive at just the tet by itself, which is the drawing in the ancient pictographic Hebrew of a basket or a container and of water, which is what? The solution to being dirty, washing. So it doesn't actually mean unclean. It can't be translated as unclean. What it should be translated is as that you are in a state of washing, right? And it makes sense because it says you will wash with water, echatz, right? You will wash with water, echatz bit ma'im. You will wash with water when you're unclean. And so the solution to uncleanness is that container of water. That's literally the word for unclean in Hebrew. And so what we started to do is accept the literal pictographs to see what these people were thinking. Like, why in the world does a sunset have something to do with people gathering around a fire? You could say it might be warmth, it might be light. No, it literally means condense. The drawing of a sunset at the horizon is an intensification of light that occurs only at that moment, right before the sun goes down behind the horizon, which consequently occurred over the Mediterranean Sea, which they already considered a place of chaos, a place of disorder, right? A place of death, a place of the unknown. If they accepted the pagan interpretations, a place of the dead. But the premise is that in their minds, they saw the sun drop behind there, and that was the end of the day, and darkness came. And the metaphorical concept of darkness then associates with what? Disorder, which is connected with the Mediterranean. And so in that way, they were saying that light is intensifying right there. That light is intensifying right there. That became the word condense. And every single word that uses the letter kof, which is Q in the English, the letter kof, is actually about gathering and density and intensity. In fact, the Hebrew word mikra, the commandment on the Sabbath that we would what? That we would have a holy convocation. That's the English translation, literally means heads gather or heads intensify, which we'll get into later. So the premise is that when we identify or understand the ancient pictographic Hebrew, two things we're accepting. Number one is we know that it was an evolution of language, right? Whether it was a combination of Akkadian and Sumerian becoming the Hebrew or the ancient Semitic, and then the pictographs deriving from maybe the Egyptian or the Sumerian cuneiform into the pictographs that we experience today. All we know is that the pottery shards that date around the Sumerian period have these ancient pictographs that just so happen to be the parent roots of the stems, which are the lexical roots in the Strong's Concordance, which have been translated into Greek and have been translated into English. Meaning what? English has to be drawn all the way back to the Sumerian period to understand what they were thinking. We know they were nomadic. We know that that meant some important things. And we know that by utilizing these ancient pictographic letters, we actually are finding that they tell stories about the word. The relevance behind this then comes into play when we start to look at the principle of being the change that the world needs. Because when you think about the Sumerian Empire, or if you think about the ancient Hebrew or ancient Semitic language, you need to think about people like Abraham or Noah, right? Or the descendants of Noah. Eber, where we get the word Hebrew, right? Peleg, which consequently means earthquake or to break apart. And it even says right there in the English, this is the time when the earth broke apart, when the earth began to separate. And people say, oh, that was just the people scattering. No. That's when the plates moved. Come on, people, wake up. And so the premise is that what you need to understand is then we have all these pictographs that we need to look at, especially the ones that have the question mark next to, that don't make sense. Why does this mean this? Why does light mean a strong mind? And when Yeshua is speaking in Hebrew to Jews, not Gentiles, but Jews who walk away and say, this man speaks with authority, not like how our teachers speak, not how our rabbis speak, but he speaks with authority. They didn't know who he was. And he says, you are the light of the world. Let your light shine. Wait a minute. You just used the word or, and you being a part of at least being slain from the foundations of the earth, which means you have some semblance of time transcendence, know that these people know this ancient pictographic language, but also that they have been what? They have been influenced not only by Babylon, which we'll talk about in a minute, but also by the other pagan nations who they allowed to infest their Torah observant lifestyles, language, and their culture. Remember, a culture is just a practice, a combination of beliefs and practices. You believe a certain way, you do the action this way. That's a culture. So when we are working with this, now you understand that when we're here, there is a vast amount of knowledge present. And as we've experienced the evolution, I would say, of this ministry, where all of a sudden I can't just take Jeff's suggestion that there's a question mark in front of this pictograph. I need to look at the pictograph and I need to start to look at the rest of reality, and I need to start seeing things over here. Remember that in general, the actual ministry model, the ministry algorithm, I don't know what else to call it, that we have is that we are seeking the most correct path. And in that process of seeking the most correct path, if we find that a path does not demonstrate through confirmation and through actionable, tangible proof that it is effective, and I'm talking about doctrine here, and dogma and traditions, then out the door it goes. Is not effective. This does not demonstrate what it is that it's saying in Scripture versus what it is that we think how we're supposed to interpret it. It doesn't show itself to bear fruit, as it were. We throw it out, and I don't care how sacred it is. I don't care how much of an essential it is. Christianity got it wrong when they became anti-Semitic and threw Passover out and embraced a pagan festival as the day to celebrate the resurrection of Christ. So they're already on the chopping block in terms of priors, right? I don't trust them. The church fathers. And even the anti-Nicene fathers demonstrated that they were also anti-Semitic. But the premise is that by the time we arrive at Nicaea, Passover is on the chopping block. It's appalling. And what's the irony is what the rabbis have done is they've just come along and said, oh, yeah, that's Christianity. That's a whole nother religion. We don't worry about that. And we still keep Passover. And it wasn't until the 70s that somebody came along and said, well, is this a salvation issue? I mean, can a Jew still celebrate Passover? Do they have to celebrate Easter? Well, not according to the fact that it was the Council of Nicaea, not God, who changed that. And so then all of a sudden there was a springing up of Torah observant believers in Christ. How beautiful. Why do I say how beautiful? Revelation 12:17. Right? They would have the testimony of Jesus Christ and the commandments of God. What makes you worthy of the process? So what I'm trying to say is that we've made some mistakes along the way. And I'm not, what I want to share with you that just like when the rabbis began to get together and decide what the Mishnah was going to be, and the Mishnah eventually became the Talmud, and the Talmud eventually became the actual bylaws, we'll call them, of Judaism that are practiced even to this day, even if they're ancient. And there's some stuff in Talmud that's pretty foul because of a interpretation, right? But there's also stuff in catechism that's pretty foul because of interpretation. There's also stuff in the Westminster Confession that's pretty foul because of interpretation. You say, oh, well, what's foul in the Westminster Confession? Well, I don't have time for that today, but I can tell you that once we start interpreting stuff, it gets all muddled and messed up. So, is there an element of needing to keep it simple? Yeah, sure. You have 5 commandments. You have 5 commandments that you have to honor correctly, the way that they were commanded, the way they were expected of the people who went through whatever they went through because they didn't keep them. And you have 5 commandments on the other side that have to do with social justice, that if you do not honor, many of them are punishable by death. In fact, they are all punishable by death. Now, I don't understand completely how that plays out in terms of judgment, because why? Because we are way far removed from how the priests would have judged the violation of those commandments. Just 10. And Yeshua narrowed it further and said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might, and love your neighbor as yourself. And you got it covered. And people can't even do that. Because now love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your might and all your soul has something to do with what's right in your own eyes. Oh, well, this is how I want to express my love for God. Okay, but this is what it says. If you love me, you'll keep my commandments. Right? But again, not really harping on that per se. All I'm saying is here's the information, right? So what's the point behind this? The point behind this is obviously we need to pay attention. Now, what's one of the next levels that occurs? We throw that path out, right? And then all of a sudden we say, okay, what is the information available that would say that that's still that path or that void has a new path that we need to walk out? And so we seek to understand that. Okay, if that's not the path, what is, right? If that's not the proper route to the grocery store, according to Google, then what is the proper route, right? That's kind of what we're asking. We're asking, where did we deviate? Why are we throwing this out? And then what's supposed to go here, right? Well, once we discover that, then we put it into practice to see if it does what we've been practicing, because this has been ineffective, right? And as we encounter that, when we are actually experiencing a proof, a prosperity, an abundance, lots of evidence that that path is what we're supposed to walk out, then we teach it to others. And we don't teach it to others until then, right? We don't sit here and say, oh, you know what? You should really try this, until we have experienced it. Oh, what a beautiful thing. Experiential knowledge. And if experiential knowledge is not allowing this path right here that we threw out to be what it is supposed to be, then obviously it's probably not supposed to be there. You say it's supposed to, what do you mean? Determinism? No, what I mean is effectiveness. Effectiveness. Okay. So why is this so important? Well, first of all, I think one of the relevant processes that is present in this is a need to remember where we've come from and what we've come to. So what was the latest thing that we've been communicated? Everything that has been made is communicating to us and I know I'm repeating the English, even though that I've done a study with you guys on what it actually means in the Greek and what it eventually means in the Hebrew, because remember, the New Testament wasn't written in Greek, where it says the invisible attributes, the divine power, and I'm sorry, the eternal power and the divine nature of God are understood in that which has been made. And we have the nerve to just go ahead and allow that to be over here as just natural order processes, trees, rocks, flowers, birds, bees, etc. And started realizing that there are repetitious symbols and repetitious items in nature that are present in the human being, that are present in things that we have created. For example, the amplification of a transistor by reattaching the voltage to the voltage that's going to the control voltage to the source voltage. All of a sudden we have amplification, which is exactly what God is trying to do. Well, this week is no exception, because one of the things that I was kind of given revelation about this week. I hate using that word because it makes me sound like I'm the end all when it comes to all this, and I'm not. The only thing that's happened is the intensification of all power in the universe through however purpose works, which I don't completely understand yet, gave me a mind to be able to make connections between things that normally would not be connected. I'm going to explain that in a minute too. So the premise is that basically what we are working with here is new knowledge comes, and as that new knowledge comes and I see confirmations on it, that usually ends up being the message. Well, this week was weird because I didn't really feel like I had coincidences, but now looking back, I had a bunch. And it's interesting because that makes me wonder whether or not maybe I had gotten complacent in listening to coincidences, or if maybe there is something new happening. Well, in that principle, I think what we really need to look at is the idea that human beings have been creating for a while now. Okay. What do I mean by that? I mean that if we go back to the Sumerian Empire, we go back to Babel, right? We go back to confusion. That's what the name of Babylon means, confusion, not rambling words. We try to establish the word Babel as rambling words by stuffing the English back into the Hebrew. But in the Hebrew, Baval means to be confused. Okay, so let's talk a minute about that whole principle, because that's another mile marker or another major important element that became present in this ministry way back when. We're going to go back to, I'm going to say Sukkot of 2021. So basically what we have going on is we have this bride, okay, in the book of Revelation. And I'm going to use a negation particle, and I'll explain why later. Okay. So in the book of Revelation, what do we have? We have this woman on this scarlet beast, right? And so what do we understand? We understand that her name is Mystery. Babylon, right? I think that's how it's spelled. Probably not. Okay. And on this side, we have the wedding feast, right? So we have this compare and contrast. Well, what have we learned about the bride? We've learned that the bride is this group of people who have made themselves ready, right? Through the quote unquote righteous acts of the saints, which ended up being what? That word daikomai in the Greek. And that word daikomai in the Greek means righteous acts, as in the righteous acts of the law. How do we know? Because in Romans chapter 8, verse 4, it says, that the righteous requirements of the law might be fulfilled in us who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. And so we know that the law is fulfilled through those who walk according to the Spirit, and that is the actual wedding gown of the bride. Then we know in obedience to Torah or in observance of Torah has something to do with the garments of the bride, what identifies her. And we know this is the contrast. She's drunk with the blood of the saints or the blood of the righteous ones. And we look back at that word righteous and we remember he made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, so we might become the righteousness of God. And furthermore, we know that the beast or the dragon or the thing that is actually creating a persecution of those saints identifies them by what? From Revelation 12:17. The commandments of God and the testimony of Yeshua. And so in that way, we can identify who or what the bride is, but then the not bride or false bride is identified by one single entity, Babylon, which is the Aramaic pronunciation for the location known as Babel. Aramaic being what? The Babylonian language. Now, there's a few people who are probably rolling over in their grave when I said that. So the bottom line is that when we have Nebuchadnezzar come and take the nation of Judah, right, the Jews, to Babylon, they there have to speak Aramaic, right, which is a dereliction of Hebrew, which we'll get to later on. But the premise is that that Aramaic then becomes a distorted reality of these ancient pictographic roots. Okay, now the reason why this is important is because when we go back, one of the things that we find is a very interesting concept, and that is the word echad is in the Hebrew. I'm going to go ahead and show you that because I think there's an important element here that we need to look at. So I'm actually going to be going to Genesis chapter 11, and I'm going to be going to verse 9, I believe it is. Actually, no. It is verse 6. Verse 6. Okay, so let me go ahead and share that with you. Okay, so here we have the Lord, right? Let's just go with Lord, and let's not worry about that it's actually Yahweh in the Hebrew and what all that means and how he could go down and look and what all that means. Let's just leave it at that the intensification of all power in the universe that we can't perceive becomes perceivable, and that perceivable is Yahweh, and that Yahweh identifies this tower in this city and the people that are building it. And this is what he says. He says, and this is in the NLT, look, he said, the people are united and they all speak the same language. After this, nothing they set out to do will be impossible for them. Okay, so let's talk about that for a second. Let's chat about that for a moment. The intensification of all power in the universe, dumbing down into something that is tangible for us as a God, we'll call it, identifies that the people are united. We're going to get to united in a minute. But then he says that nothing would be impossible for them. So one of the greatest revelations that this ministry has ever gotten is when we looked into the Hebrew and we saw this word right here. Echad. Echad. Why? Because there were two very important elements here. The first element is in its simplicity that when we go back to Genesis chapter 2, which is the first usage of echad. In fact, I tell you what I'll do. I will take you guys on a journey really quick, okay? So we're going to go here and we're going to go into the interlinear. We're going to hit the word echad, jump to the Strong's Concordance number, go down to its first usage. Genesis 1:5. Okay? Genesis 1:5. So what do we know? We know that it is the first day. God called the light day and the darkness night, and evening passed and morning came, making the first day. Well, no, that's not actually what it means in the Hebrew. It means a unity, as it were, of chaos. But I'm going to put something out there that's kind of crazy. So there was this one Orthodox Jew that I was talking to, who was a very open-minded, gentle human being. And although he opposed Christianity and he opposed Messianics because he was still Orthodox, he liked to give tidbits of information. And he said, one of the things that drives me crazy is that the word one is used for the word echad. And I was like, really? He goes, yeah. And I was like, why? He says, well, when I was in yeshiva, the rabbis taught me that it means alone, that God is alone. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is alone. And the premise is that without us, there is no point. And so that's why he had Adam go get go name the animals, is because there's a desire for us to join him in this. More on that later. So the premise is that that's where echad starts. But then we get into something interesting, right? Because now what happens? Genesis 2:24. Let's just go ahead and go there. If we can. Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. In the NLT, this explains why a man leaves his mother and father and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one. And of course, what does it say in the King James? It says, therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother and shall cleave to his wife. Oh, that's a powerful word. If you guys knew what cleave meant in the Hebrew, you'd fall over. Unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. In the Hebrew, basar echad. Okay, basar echad. So all of a sudden, echad has something to do with the consummation and intimate connection that occurs between a husband and a wife. Uh-oh, we have bridal information coming all of a sudden. So echad has something to do with bridal information. Now we have this Orthodox guy, this gentle spirit telling me that God is alone. And it starts to make sense to me, right? Now all of a sudden I'm realizing there's a bride. There's a bride for God, and it's us. And then all of a sudden I ran into what is actually the right or the rightful new covenant. Jeremiah chapter 31 through 33. And that is literally this concept here. Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. And just as a side note, which are you, house of Israel or house of Judah? Because that's the only ones he made the new covenant with. We'll get to that later. Maybe not today. Not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers the day that I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, which my covenant which they broke, although I was a husband to them, saith the Lord. Oh, there's some more marriage symbolism, right? Marriage speech. Okay. So in principle, we now understand there's this significance between this bride and this bride in the sense of what it as he being alone, as it were, contains, right? Well, what do we have? We have they are all one, right? They have become this singularity, all right? They have become this singularity, and what? They have one tongue, lashon, and this is what they endeavor to do. What were they endeavoring to do? Well, if we look at the physical, there's a simplicity to it. They use tar instead of mortar, right? To what? To create a waterproof city. Anybody who has actually gone and put tar on the side of a wall and gotten it all over themselves because they were sealing that concrete wall because it was a basement before they backfilled knows what the tar is capable of. Waterproofing, keeping the water out of the house on that lower level, right? And so what? Now they have that in the ark, right? Bitumen, it's called. That's in the ark, right? And then that is in this city. And then they have this huge tower that reaches the heavens, which I'm not even get into what that actually means, but I could tell you in the physical level or in the logical level, they made a snorkel. Why? Because the flood just came. So what are they saying? Forget your rainbow. I don't care about your rainbow. We don't want your promises. We're going to do our own thing. And when we're not going to allow ourselves to be scattered, right? They were afraid to be scattered. And here's the irony. Their fear of being scattered, they decided to try to mess with things they didn't understand. And the result of that was nothing was going to be impossible for them. That doesn't make sense. These are men who I want you to think about when the intensification of all power in the universe, or at least Yahweh, let's go with, decides to intervene. Ergo the flood, right? When does he decide enough's enough? He intervenes here, which means what? He didn't like what they were doing. They were messing with stuff they didn't understand. And in that process, nothing was going to be impossible for them. Think about the most impossible thing that you could think of in your entire life. And they were capable of it because they were all one tongue and they were echad. And we're going to get to that. But that made them a bride, right? How do we know? Because there's this woman in Revelation who is not the bride, but it's Babel. It goes all the way back, right? So in recap, we know that the true bride, what? Has the garments that are what? The righteous acts of the saints, which is that word dikomai. And that word dikomai is the same word used in Romans chapter 8, verse 4, which is that the righteous requirements of the law might be fulfilled through us who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit, right? And then after that, then we have this kind of this context or this idea that the flesh cannot be subject to the law of God, right? And is enemies with God because of that. Oh my gosh, how are people missing this? But wait, there's more. Okay, so we have this false bride versus this true bride, and this false bride at one point in time had echadness and nothing was impossible for them. So if we arrived at a state of echadness, then we would what? We would be able to have nothing be impossible for us. But understanding that echadness requires you to look outside of just what the Bible says about this situation. Why do I say that? Because not all the information is given in this short little, 9 verses about Babel, which becomes the focal point of the focal point of the parabolic information of the antithesis of a Torah observant people like Israel, Babylon. Babylon takes Judah away from Jerusalem, destroys the temple, right? Babylon has the languages confused, and therefore the people scatter, and the entire world becomes the peoples of the earth, right? Babylon persecutes the saints in the book of Revelation, which is a book that nobody understands and thinks they do, right? Sorry, Jenkins and The other guy got it wrong. They got it way wrong. And I could tell you that my relationship with the Father, right? The anthropomorphical assignment of Yahweh being the provider, the instructor, and the protector has told me to stay out of the book of Revelation. I am not allowed to study it. But I do have these small little references to things that I understand. And I can tell you this understanding was big because I realized that there was a counterfeit. And that leads us to our next part, which is that counterfeitness or fakeness attracts malevolent beings who intercept light or intercept what? A strong mind. Demons. And the interesting thing about the word demonazio is it has two elements to it. First, it has an element of accusatory speech, which is the premise that there was some sort of character assassination occurring. But then the second part was what? That there was this messed up brain. In contemporary Greek, demonazio is not used to describe a malevolent being who's bent on the destruction of humans, but instead on mental health problems. Can't remember that reference, and I would love to give it to you. So now, in that process, we have this idea that the strong mind has something to do with the bride. The strong mind has something to do with obedience to the commandments of God. The strong mind is how the dragon, which we're going to get to in a minute, identifies the saints of God, as it were. And that dragon is somehow identified with Babel. So we have the false bride creating a destructive process of the real bride, which again is not the opposite of the bride, but an absence of the bride. Okay? The authentic bride. And we discovered that counterfeit attracts demons. When you go fake, you get malevolent beings. Okay? And those malevolent beings run nations, and those nations infest us with what? With things that would violate Torah. And when we allow that infestation, they become oppressive, which is usually going to require, or it's going to lead to the nation possessing the nation of Israel, right? Midian possessed Israel. And then they cry out. Remember the cycle of Israel. They cry out, and then what? He sends a judge, and that judge then what? Leads them to victory, which they could have had in the first place by not allowing the infestation and eradicating it. Okay? Same is true of our brains and our minds and the process there. Because why? Because that which has been made describes the invisible attributes, which we could accept are the emanations of God, or the 13 attributes of mercy, as it were, or perhaps even the 10 Sifrot. But the premise is that the invisible attributes, the divine nature, right? What makes God different from us, right? My thoughts are not your thoughts, which consequently is that word machashabet again. We'll get into that in a minute. Or perhaps maybe we'll get into that in another series. But the premise is that basically we are encountering this idea of imagination over and over and over and over and over again. So now what we need to do is we need to ask, okay, what is humanity doing? Augustine was the first one to postulate that the problem was a nature or a predisposition to be evil as a result of that scripture in Genesis chapter 8, where it says man's imaginations are evil from childhood continually. By presenting the argument that humanity was bad, he was able to introduce the doctrine of hell, of total depravity, of predestination, and all of the other doctrines that accompany the 5-point Calvinistic view, but also the Lutheran view. And I'll explain that a little bit. Luther was an Augustinian. He was of the Augustinian order, okay? Calvin's mentor was of the Augustinian order, but it wasn't an Augustinian order at that time. So Calvin's mentor actually studied under and loved Augustine, okay? So what's my point? Propagation, right? Propagation into the two facets of what become modern American Protestant Christianity, factor in Western social democratic influence, and get rid of what? Get rid of the Eastern Republic, right? Self-reliant or libertarian view completely, right? Those were the heretics. Those were the ones who did not make it through. Why? Because the Western Empire beat the Eastern Empire, which eventually became the Holy Roman Empire. And what? The Bishop of Rome beat the Bishop of Antioch at Nicaea. Do you know that the Bishop of Antioch wrote a letter to Nicaea begging them not to do what they were doing? Explaining where the actual base of the church was, and claiming that there were no proof that there was no proof that the seat of Christianity sat in Rome. So you see now how history plays a role. You see now how intuition plays a role. You see how oligarchism plays a role, et cetera, right? But the premise is that as we work this out, one of the more important elements that we need to factor in is that there were these question marks next to the pictographs, and that there's a counterfeit, and it will look like the bride, but she's not the bride, and it'll be accompanied by a demonic possessive nation who does not honor the Torah of Yahweh. And when I say nation, I don't mean established civilization with states. I don't mean provinces. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is a people who are echad, or who are connected in by that process. Okay, so the next most important subject or thought process then is we understand that there seems to be some sort of action or movement of humanity towards something. And I can tell you that Christianity thinks that it is something evil. But that's because they've been taught that to expect that there's going to be total depravity in the world. They've been taught to believe that we are destined for hell unless we accept Christ, which is absolute Catholic construct. Now, I could go into all the reasons why I don't believe in hell. And I can go into all the reasons why and prove to you that that is not what Yeshua talked about. That is not what is mentioned in Scripture. In fact, the Hebrew word for the place of the dead or the grave is Sheol, which literally is an infinitive of the word Sheol, which means to ask. So what is it? The question. Sheol is the question. What happens next? We don't know. We put ourselves in the box. We decay our bones. We put our bones in we put ourselves in the ground. We decay our bones. We put our bones in a box, and we don't know what we're doing. Okay, but once we get into a need to what? Create indulgences to actually influence the funding of the Sistine Chapel, which Luther opposed and still embraced the doctrine of hell. Didn't make any sense to me at all. 95 Thesis challenges the idea that you can deliver yourself out of purgatory through monetary purchase because of a blessing that a priest says, but ceases to have the wisdom to address the fact that the construct of hell, thank you, Milton, and thank you, Dante, for creating this illustration of what it supposedly is, because that's what we have today. That's exactly how it works today. And people who claim they've been there and people who say they came back and this is what they experienced all line up with Dante. So either Dante had revelation that Yeshua didn't even speak about, or it's a construct. And it's all part of a plan to control. What's my point behind that? My point behind that is that when we are working with this, we need to accept that humanity is not in a state of evil other than its choice not to keep Torah. Romans chapter 8. Now I will get into the discussions, right? I will get into the discussions. What does it mean to keep Torah? Are we properly interpreting this? What does it say in the Hebrew? Are we properly doing this right? I mean, a good example is Yom Kippur. That word anah means to be poor, right? It doesn't, or humble. It doesn't mean to fast. So why do we not eat? I have no idea, but I can tell you this. There are plenty of other scriptures to back up that you're not supposed to eat on Yom Kippur. But I can also tell you this. That word does not mean not to eat. It means to be poor, as in without. As in somebody provides for you because you can't provide for yourself. So there's plenty we could get into about how to interpret or what to do. I have plenty of people who will make the argument on how to keep the Sabbath. I have plenty of people who make the argument on how to honor the feast days. We've got the loony solar people, right? We've got the flat earth people trying to say that this is how we're supposed to keep the feast days because of the movement of the planets and the movement of the moon and all that. And then we have people who are just like, you know what? I'm glad Christ rose from the dead, right? Ancient pagan ritual of hiding an egg covered in blood so that when whatever child finds that egg is the one who is sacrificed, so that there would be an equality in the idea of a child sacrifice, which was demanded by some demonic entity that was in possession of that nation. Oh wait, we just came full circle, didn't we? Counterfeit attracts malevolence. Malevolence possesses. Malevolence requires a blood sacrifice. Human sacrifice. Okay. And in that process, then, and I know we're going to have fun with that one in the Midrash, but in that process, then we encounter the deliverance, the Yeshua principle, the violent destroyer removing the sheep out of the wolf's mouth by crushing his head with a club. Remember, Yeshua means destroyer watches. And Yasha means to snatch away violently, to go in and take, like Abraham did with Lot. Abraham demonstrated the Yeshua principle perfectly when he became the ruler of the Canaanite kingdoms, when he conquered the king who had taken control of the other Canaanite kingdoms. But the premise is that when we're working with this, we need to understand that that's what we've been taught. We've been taught that there's this evil thing within us that eventually is going to drive us to hell, and the intensification of all power in the universe, who supposedly is this intensely benevolent being, is going to give us 75 to 80 years, according to Moses in Psalm 90, or maybe it was 95, to get it right. And if we don't, we have eternal conscious punishment. I want to vomit. First of all, I won't serve a God like that. And if that ends me up there, fine. But I won't serve a God like that. And I can tell you the God I serve definitely has a lot more mercy than that, considering that the first thing that was out of his mouth when he showed the glory to Moses, or his back parts, declares the Lord merciful. No, in the Hebrew, Yahweh Racham, to what? To experience the pain of another and to diligently desire for them to be relieved from it. In which I named myself, remember, Ben Racham, because I want it to be who I become. I want to be the compassionate one. And I tell you, it ain't easy. Ever since I gave myself that name, there's been times I have wanted to destroy on so many levels. But the premise is that as we walk this out and as we experience this, we need to change how we think. Because what you really need to realize is that your body demonstrates how you actually really are. Because why? It's one of 4 bodies, maybe one of 5. We won't get into that today. Your emotional body, your cognitive body, your physical body, and your spiritual body are all echad. They're all one. They're alone. There's nothing else in that process. So what does that mean? That means that something else needs to come along and influence it. Okay? And so the premise is that when we talk about our physical body, what do we see? We see a desire for homeostasis, a proper balance of hormones, chemicals, biochemical processes, etc. The autonomic systems, right? The systems that we don't choose to actually control, but that are controlled by the subconscious. Those systems seek perfection. You give a broken bone long enough, it will heal. Do we still need to reset it? Yep. Remember, it's echad. It's alone. So it needs an outside influence, right? It needs something to help it heal. Okay. But the premise is that in that process, our mind, our heart, and our spiritual self are all influenced, affected, and have symptoms of that ailment. Broken bone is a broken bone in the spirit, a broken bone in the brain, a broken bone in the emotions. However it works out, those all manifest with each other in complete unity. So in that premise, then, if we look at the body, remember, we're going to learn about the eternal power, the divine nature, and the attributes of God through that which has been made, then we are going to look at the human body to realize that total depravity is a false heretical doctrine, and that original sin is a false heretical doctrine, especially when you cognate that sin is a transgression of the law, 1 John chapter 3, verse 4. And so when we are experiencing this concept, it is very, very important for you to realize you are not by nature evil. You're not malevolent by nature. Those are side effects of something bad, which we can talk about, but not today. Now, why is that so important? Because when we start to get into this process, you're going to realize that humanity has been trying to create that which it actually needs to become. The transistor last week showed us who we really are and what we need to do. The amplification of the transistor showed us what the intensification of all power in the universe is trying to do with us for a purpose. Some of that purpose we don't understand, because when you get into the thought process that the intensification of all power in the universe allowed this mess in the first place and then sent people to fix it, it can get hairy, right? Way above my pay grade, and I ain't going to mess with it. All I know is what I am supposed to do here. I am the change that this world needs. And how do I know that? Because I'm the problem. I am the one who needs to change. I'm the one who needs to get rid of my wounds through healing. I need to let go of my entitlements through humility. I need to experience a future self now instead of a failure. Those are hard things to do, but I can tell you, I intend to do it because everybody else is expecting everybody else to change. Fine, I'll be the one. I'll do the change. Is it easy? No. Am I perfect? No. But I'm doing the best I can to achieve that perfection because my body does it. My body wants homeostasis. My body wants equilibrium. Without equilibrium, you couldn't even stand up, walk. You could barely think. I've had my little rocks. I don't know what they are. I've had my little rocks get tweaked. And I had vertigo. And this doctor comes along and says, okay, lay this way, roll this way, twist your head this way. And all of a sudden I was fine. Equilibrium is important, but it's not malevolent. It's not original sin. It's striving towards balance. Harmonic vibration. The principle and the idea that malevolent, let's change that malevolent. Harmful elements that are in the body, solids that are in the body, vibrate at very low frequencies. Those same frequencies are connected to negative emotions like sadness, depression, anger, anxiety, fear, happen to vibrate at the same frequencies as the solids. Lower frequencies, I'm saying, not necessarily the same frequencies, but lower frequencies. And then the higher frequencies are emitting, and listen, we are not talking some weird voodoo stuff. We're talking about nodes attached to the brain and brain waves showing these scientists the difference between the two. But when we factor in the spiritual, we have a whole nother level of something interesting, and we're going to get into that in a moment. But the premise is there's something that we have created that has actually shown us who we are actually becoming. Humanity is trying to create physical anomaly, not physical anomalies, physical, tangible, identifiable actions and objects and processes because of who they actually are tending towards, what they are actually tending towards. I remember the day when Yahweh told me, the book of Revelation doesn't have to happen. What? You want me to repeat that to humans? I'm scared to death to tell you that it is your fault that Revelation is happening. And that you can change it, that the world does not have to end. The world does not have to happen that way. How do I know? Because Isaiah, as a prophet, went to the people and said, you do not have to go to Babylon. You don't have to. Jeremiah said, you don't have to go through this. It's going to happen. If you don't do these things, what were those things? Torah. But regardless, you don't have to go through this. Well, guess what? You don't have to go through this. But I'm telling you, Christian doctrine says you do. Christian doctrine says that you have to because you're evil. Well, I'm here to tell you, he told a bunch of unbelieving Jews. How do we know they were unbelieving? Because they didn't know he was the Messiah. Isn't that one of the requirements? Look at Romans chapter 10, right? Verse 9, I think it is. If you confess with your mouth and believe in your heart that Yeshua is Lord and that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Now we could get into what salvation is, and we could get into soteriology, which is the study of salvation. But what's my point? My point is that these people did not believe, and he said, you're the light of the world. Let your light shine amongst men. Oh, now John in his humility says, I bore witness of the light, but I was not the light. I love John's humility. Go read all of John and read all of the letters of John, and you will see this beautiful humility. See it in James too, but that's another story. So the premise is that what we are working with here is that we, us humans, even atheists, have created things because we're tending towards something, and it's because of what and who we want to be. Now, right now in this world, I'm finally going to get to my point. Right now in this world, we are experiencing a phenomenon that humanity as a whole is extraordinarily skeptical of and afraid of. Now, I will address fear really quick. Remember, fear is an imagination about the future that may or may not happen, and micro adjustments that we make to it, and that results in attraction. I'm going to get into attraction real quick, okay? So the next thing that we need to talk about is parallelism, or we need to talk about what it means to be alone, as in so connected that there is an outside influence that will affect that entire unit, okay? So here's the premise. The premise is that if we have, go ahead and switch this over to here. The premise is that if we have a, let's just say this is going to be negative, and this is going to be positive, okay? If we have a charge of electricity moving from positive to negative or negative to positive, either one, okay? So moving from a negative to a positive, we could think in terms of emotion, frequency, vibration, energy, all of that, okay? Vibe. You walk into a room. Let's talk about this for a minute. There's a point in time where you're just going to have to accept and stop worrying about and being afraid of energy. But the premise is that if you walk into a room and it seems quiet and uncomfortable, that's a vibe that you experience, right? Some Pentecostal might call it discernment. Some Baptist might say it was just uncomfortable in there. It doesn't really make a difference. Something is off, and you feel it off, and you can't explain why you feel it off. That's energy, okay? So if we're working with this and we say negative energy to positive energy, we say negative emotion to positive emotion, we say negative imaginations to positive imaginations, we say false doctrine to truth, we say guilt to mercy, etc. We are somehow working with an ascension. And I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to switch this around just so that we can work with ascension the way our brains think about ascension. We'll do it this way. Okay? So, and I know that some of you are going to say, wait a minute, current goes from positive to negative. Let it go. Okay, so the premise is that if we have two parallel circuits separate from each other, two parallel charges of electricity moving, right, in the same direction, we have a magnetic field. See, I think I'm going to do a different color here for the magnetic field. We have a magnetic field around those. This is the concept of induction, right? We have this idea of things, these magnetic fields spinning around these all the way down the line, right? And that creates, I'll do it this way. That creates this, okay? Sorry, here you go. That creates this, which is what? An attractive force. It draws these entities together, okay? And so what is this? This is attraction. Now, this is electromagnetism. Dear God, did I butcher that? Hold on one second. I guess I didn't really butcher it. I kind of butchered it. Okay, attraction. All right. And so the premise is that when two positive or um when two charges of electricity are moving in the same direction, an induction is created, and that induction results in a force that draws the two entities together. And we've identified that this is exactly how it works in our walk with God, where we, as we move in what? Unison with Him, we are drawn closer to Him. And it makes sense, right? Listen to what James says. James says, resist the devil and he will flee from you. Okay, that makes sense, right? So don't walk down that path with him, because why? It will create a disattraction. It will create a movement away. It will reverse the polarity of the magnetic fields, right? Are we dealing with the spirit here? Of course we are. Why? Because that which has been created tells us the rest, right? This is the concept or the idea of the instruction or the will of God is on earth as it is in heaven. What happens in the areas where we don't understand is now being given to us in the areas where we do understand, so that we can understand the areas where we don't. And so we want to understand the spirit. We need to look at electricity because it's energy, and everything is about energy, frequency, and vibration, right? Everything is energy, frequency, and vibration. And so we have this premise or this idea that these paths create an attraction. When you align, and we can get into frequency and talk about resonance, when you align two vibrations on the same frequency, there is what we call resonance, and that resonance creates an energy, and we could get into how that has to do with attraction as well. But the premise that I'm trying to get across is when you are moving in a certain direction, the direction you're moving, because I'm going to share something with you here in a minute, and that is, or when you're moving in a certain direction, and another thing is moving in that same direction, they attract each other. Now, that can be true if the current was flowing this way. If the current was flowing from positive and negative, so you're going from a good attitude to a bad attitude, you're going to attract bad attitudes. That's the premise here. Now, the reason why this is functionally important is because when we deal with this idea of what happened in Babel, they were echad. They were all moving in the same direction, and nothing was impossible for them. So the question is why? Well, now we have another recap that we have to talk about. And that recap that we have to talk about is simple. It's dominion. The entire universe was subject to Adam and his sons. That's it. The sons of Adam rule the universe through their authority. Their authority, which consequently has something to do with attraction. So as a bad attitude transfers to a good attitude and we attract other good attitudes, the universe says, oh, look, good attitudes. Let's shower that with good attitude dust, right? Let's bless it. You say, who is the universe? All creation, everything that has been made. Remember this? Everything that has been made conspires on your behalf to be obedient to the sons of Adam. It's neutral. It doesn't say, oh, well, you know what? I kind of don't like this guy, and so I'm going to dump all this junk on him. No. But if this guy's got junk going on, he's going to attract junk, and the universe will go, okay, here's some junk. Because it's being obedient, right? Which means dominion plays a role here. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. Okay? So what do we have? We have this premise that if there is a parallel agreement between two entities and they are moving in the same path or direction, then there is an attraction. And that attraction is eventually going to what? Unite into something that is so one that it is alone. Okay? Okay. So the premise is that there's a necessity to what? To actually align. And we're going to get to alignment here in a minute. Okay. So remember, I was talking about something that has been made has actually, it actually proves to me what the world or what humanity is trying to become, because it's their destiny, it's their potential. Okay, let's go with that. It's their potential. All right, so here we go. I think we've got enough information about oneness. I think we've got enough information about attraction. I think we've got enough information about imagination. And I think we've got enough information about counterfeit versus authentic. And I think we have enough information about the wounds, entitlements, and limiting beliefs, creating those imaginations, etc. Okay, so let's roll with this. Rene Descartes was the first one to come up with a system by which you could chart information. And I'm sure anybody who's been in school or anybody who uses business analysis or any type of data analysis understands this this XY system, right? And we know that there's this concept that it can kind of go this way, right? That it can be that this is the negative, that this is the positive, that this is the positive, and this is the negative. And so this is like 0, 0, as it were, right? And so the premise is then what we have something called regression, which I'll explain in a minute. But the thought process is that when he came up with this, he realized that you could chart all kinds of things with this system. So one of the things that he came up with, or one of the things that he helped to discover, let's say that he discovered it. Let's go with that. Let's leave humanity in a state of humility that we're actually discovering things that already exist. Okay, but what he would do, and I'm just going to try to be random here, but it's almost impossible to be random, especially if you get bored with it, then you will actually repeat those things. And some of these are just way too long to work with this correctly. So I'm gonna get rid of this one, this one, this one, and that'd probably be good. And so the principle is then, as we put all this information in, this is data, right? And so there would be like a list of data here in a table, right? And information would be present there. And so, like, for example, one of the pieces of information is 0, 0. And this shows position. This shows position on maps. This shows position in, business analysis, because all of these are little pieces of information or data, okay? Now, there is a concept or an idea called classing, which is that some data can be classed with other data because it has a similarity of some sort. For example, if we were to say that there was a cat, okay? So what do we know about cats? Well, they're of the feline, right? They're of the feline, and we know that there are house cats and there are wild cats, and that although they have similarities, we can safely say that a tiger is not a house cat. So if we wanted to categorize or say that a tiger was a house cat, then it would be an error, okay? It would be an error in analysis. So the reason this is important is because there's actually a formula, and there's actually a natural state in which all of these have something in common, and that one thing in common, let's see, we're going to use a different color here. That one thing in common creates a line through them all, okay? That is the most probable line of everything being in common. Anything out from that point has a probability that it is like that thing, okay? But it's not necessarily that true line. And so what happens is that there's a boundary, and that boundary is based upon a weighting that scientists put into play, but that boundary then becomes the important element here, and that boundary out here is as far as we will accept that information is like that original line that has all those things in common, okay? And so the premise is that when we experience this data, this is kind of like this, but not, okay? And so what happens is now you tell a computer to learn all of this stuff out here and all of this stuff out here and all of this stuff inside of those two blue lines, and to figure out what's different about them. Now, the reason why this is so important is because it is based upon something, this is called linear regression, but it's based upon it's based upon an actual philosophy. The philosophy is that everything is linear. So a connection from here to here, say a connection from cat to house cat, is okay. But there's no world in which tiger can be house cat. Well, I'm going to share a concept with you, and that concept is that that is actually not true. And so the premise is that there is actually a idea that there's a state in which a tiger can be a house cat. Now, the reason why this is important is because this is what we call block logic, okay? Now, behind me is something called blockchain. And as you can see, it is not linear. And as you can see, it has many connections to the same node. You can see this node has 1, 2, 3, 4 connections, and there's probably more. Why? Because what we've done is we created instead of limiting it to those 2 dimensions of X and Y, we've created a Z, but then we took it a step further and we just let it be whatever it was going to be. Then we told the computer to use linear regression and that scatter diagram I just showed you to look and see what was similar and what was not similar, and to find the most probable, proper, connected path. Well, guess what that is? That is AI. And the premise behind AI is that it actually is doing something that ancient Hebrew peoples did. And that's why I say that humanity is tending towards something amazing, because they've created a computer that wants to connect things that shouldn't connect. And now all of a sudden, things make sense on a whole nother level. Now they want the computer to just solve simple problems like, write an essay for me that contains this, 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 and this. And so the computer goes through and has already had a lot of learning, and I'll explain the learning here in a minute. But the premise is that the computer's gone through and is looking at all of its learnings and saying, this is the most probable path of all these, using standard deviation of all these, this is how far I can go out from that path and still be within the context of a viable essay that meets those requirements. And it will write the essay. And that terrifies people. But what you don't realize is why we created it. We created it because our minds don't believe we are supposed to be in linear logic. Now, binary process and logic gates from the transistor have actually created a bias that we believe that we have to have logic present in order to do computer processes. But what these AIs are showing us is that they will take a piece of information from over here and they will pull it in. And they'll take a piece of information from over here and they'll pull it in and they will create this model. But what AI doesn't realize that it's doing and what scientists don't realize they're doing is they are actually modeling. They're actually, and I'll explain modeling in a minute, they're actually modeling the most ideal or correct path. In a sense, they are actually looking at the current paths and realizing that they might not be correct, throwing them out, and what? Putting in a new path and testing it. And if it works, then they are altering their walk and teaching it to others. So the premise is that in all of that, all of a sudden things that don't make sense now all of a sudden start to make sense. For example, when Yeshua says, seek ye first the kingdom of heaven and his righteousness and all these things. What things? What is it saying there? It's talking about our everyday needs. Wait a minute. Seek ye first the kingdom of heaven and all his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. And somebody in Christianity has the nerve to say, oh, that's easy. You just seek Christ and you'll receive everything. Has that happened to you? Has that happened to you? Do you feel like the things that you worry about in fear because you believe in Christ have any different encounter than the person who doesn't believe in Christ and worries about in fear? Because remember, Yeshua said the heathen worries about that. But seek ye first the kingdom of heaven, all its righteousness, and that will be added unto you. What? Those things that you're worried about. And then he goes on in another parable sometime down the road, or maybe it was in his direct communication with his disciples, which is a whole nother level. He says, kingdom of heaven is within you. So what in the world are we supposed to seek? If it's within you, where do you go in you to seek the kingdom of heaven? And how does that equate to prosperity, which is basically what he said? He said Solomon in all of his glory is arrayed like one of these lilies of the valley. He's saying they have no interest in human process. A plant only moves in one direction towards nutrition, towards food. And a plant may have some defensive systems, but generally speaking, cannot move away from danger. That's the difference between a plant and an animal. An animal can move away from danger. A plant cannot. If danger comes, the plant just kind of has to take it, right? And if you look at the frequencies of a plant, interestingly enough, they are very different from the frequencies of an animal, which are very different from the frequencies of a human, which are very different from the frequencies of a rock. But the premise is that Solomon in all of his glory, let's talk about that for a minute. So the dude makes silver so common that it's actually pavement. I want you to go drive on the road, drive your car on the road and picture that being silver, because that's what Solomon did, right? He paved the roads with silver. Now, the reason why that is so important is because that's the amount of money that was coming in. Go look at the price of silver today, right? Gold, the amount of gold that he brought in was upwards of like 12 million a month, okay? I think that was a proper calculation. I don't really care. whether it's proper calculation, because we know Solomon in all of his glory was not arrayed like one of these. In other words, he was not clothed like one of these lilies. One of these lilies that has to depend upon the created things to provide for it. Okay? The sun, the moon, the stars, the weather, the rain, right? Nutrients in the soil, microorganisms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's what, so Yeshua is saying that, right? And then he says, but seek ye first the kingdom of heaven, and all that stuff will happen, right? And he says stuff like, he talks about, don't say that you will go from one city to another on this specific day to do business, because tomorrow's not promised. But seek ye first the kingdom of heaven, and all those things will be added to you. And then says the kingdom of heaven is within you. Then there's probably something that we need to understand about us, right? And we've gone through the Elohim series and talked about power and whatnot, right? And so in that same process, what I'm trying to tell you is the reason why humans created that is because they know that linear logic is not proper. And if linear logic is not proper, then guess what gets to get thrown out? Bylaws, doctrine, dogma, traditions of men. Improper interpretation of ancient pictographic letters that, unless you look at them literally and just accept that, they don't make sense. What does a human head and an ox's head have to do with light? Photon emission, right? And then we have all kinds of crazy stuff going on. We start to get into the double slit experiment, and we start to get into the theory and the concepts of quantum mechanics and spin and quantum entanglement, quantum tunneling, unified field, right? The premise is that every time we turn around, it's not what we thought. But we're arrogant, we're prideful, and we're fearful. People don't want this to change. People don't want to let go of the overarching power that the church has over the people, because they've been told that that's wickedness, that that's heresy. When the truth is Martin Luther was right, and he was an anti-Semitic jerk. He promoted and approved of violence against Jews. And yet, he was right. The Pope does not have the power and is not the vicar of Christ, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But all that mess had to do with control, had to do with controlling the people. And why is that so important? Because we're going to have to break out of that mentality. The truth is that we really like to be told what to do. We really like to be told, this is what it means. And it's not because we are lazy per se, in the sense of laziness, that you make a choice to not do anything, but that we are afraid to strike out on our own, because the grand picture that's been painted is if you strike out on your own, you end up in eternal conscious punishment. Now, I'm not saying throwing the Bible out. I'm not saying throw Paul out. I'm not saying do this, that with the canon. I'm sure we could probably benefit from a re-examination of the canon. Although theologians in the colleges say, nope, this is the most logical one. I would be curious what canon an AI would make. I would be so curious if we had all those documents that were destroyed in the 300s as they began to compile the Bible. If we had those things, I would be curious to see what AI would actually say was the canon, based upon a complete reading within seconds of all of the manuscripts. Why is this so important? Because I believe that as we move away from linear logic and we begin to allow more open-mindedness, I'm not talking a deviation from Torah. What I'm talking about, because some commandments are pretty self-explanatory. You can't really get around them. You can't really twist them. You can't really manipulate them unless you tweak. There's a guy who I keep around. And when I say keep around, what I mean is I still watch his stuff. And one of the reasons I do is because I can't stand him. And I love to see what my opponents say, as it were. But he says, I would just like to make a public announcement. It's a short, right? It's on YouTube, or maybe it was on TikTok. Anyways, I would like to make a public announcement. Any attempt to interpret the New Testament is going to require a, recalibration. That's not the word he said. A renegotiation of that scripture because of a loss of culture and a loss of language understanding and a loss and this dude's a pro. Like, this dude is one of the primary interpreters for scripture. Like, he knows the languages, he knows the cultures, he knows everything about them. Now, he falls short in some areas, and I can't stand him, right? But that right there is so true. You have to manipulate the culture of Judaism in the first century to come up with what you believe today in American Christianity. You have to. You have to renegotiate. In other words, you have to alter what it actually meant. And that's powerful. That's powerful when we get into the doctrine of hell. It's powerful when we get into demonology. That's powerful when we get into the doctrine of salvation. So why is this so important? Why was this message scary? Because I believe that we can actually look at machine learning and realize that these AIs are actually concluding something different than scientists are. They're concluding something different than authors are, than musicians are, because we have been thinking like Greeks in linear logic. And of course, in the beginning, that made sense. That worked, right? When we got into binary systems and we got into transistors and we got into logic gates and we were able to actually create latching and memory, and all of a sudden we had random access memory, and we had read-only memory, we had flashing. Next thing you know, we had the 8088 and the 8088, which was basically, or the 8086, which is basically the first Intel chip. And next thing you know, we're off and running. And now we've got computers saying, that's not the conclusion I come to. Why? Because they opened through the programming. We're not talking about some separate entity that thinks for itself. Don't get me wrong. I figured out a way to have it write its own code. But the premise is that what we're doing is we're just introducing a bunch of information and telling it to linearly regress and through the scatter diagram, find that information. And it was like, no, actually what we need is to be able to not be limited by 2 dimensions. Let's put it to 3. And all of a sudden, block logic started occurring. And I'm telling you, blockchain technology is probably one of the most powerful up and coming technologies that exists at this time, because it changed the way that we think about thinking. And it changed the way that we understand things. Well, guess what? Hebrews have been doing that for years. I remember the first time I heard from a Messianic Jew teacher, a rabbi, the difference between linear logic and block logic. When all of a sudden, a tiger could be a house cat. And where do we see that? We see that sometimes in India, et cetera, especially in the royalty of India, we see the Bengal tiger being used or being bred and raised as pets. But if we actually began to categorize wild cats and house cats, we would separate them. The reason why this is so important is because when we start to look at the ancient pictographic Hebrew, we can't stay on the linear level. We need to be able to connect this to this. There was a rabbi once. I love his book. I can't remember the name of it. It's blue and it's Rabbi Hirsch. Okay. And I have his chumash, but he believed that there was a connection between one word and another word, and I'll explain what I mean. So what he would do, and I illustrated this once with a cone, that he would work down into deeper and deeper information, and as he did, almost like an iceberg. So let's say that we started with, and I'll just give you an example of what he did so that you can understand what I'm talking about instead of me trying to explain visual things to you without showing you, okay? So the premise is that what he did is take, for example, let's take the simplest word we can think of. Let's see, in the beginning. Nah, that doesn't work. Trying to think. Okay, let's use truth. Okay. So we know that truth, and we talked about this last week, has to do with let's see if this will work right here. Nope, that's not what I wanted. There we go. So truth has to do with the Aleph, the Mem, and the Tav. Now, what Rabbi Hirsch believed is because of the ancient pictographic roots that this, which is what we call a permutation, actually is somehow connected to this. Okay? That is somehow connected. And that this permutation is actually somehow connected. And like I said, I'm just showing you an example, right? So the idea is that if you switch the letters around, that there is a connection between those meanings. Well, do you know what that logic is called? That logic is called blockchain. Rabbi Hirsch, I believe he was maybe 1800s, 1700s, I don't know. Rabbi Hirsch, a Hebrew linguist and a master of the Hebrew language and an understanding of cognates, which is where the sheen and the seen have the sound of S, right? And so you can just substitute that sheen in with that seen and take the new word and compare it to the old word and figure out why they mean what they mean and how they have a connection. Oh my gosh. The thing that we could do with the ancient pictographic Hebrew and do this is out there already, right? It's available to us. But we need to stop thinking like peasants, believing that we need to somehow be connected to this king, okay? Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that we just throw off the authority of Christ or the sovereignty of Christ, or that we throw off the authority of Yahweh, get rid of Torah and throw it out. What I'm saying is there's more things connected than what we realize. In fact, everything is connected. Now, in times past, I have been illustrating for you this idea of this river, right? I'm going to talk a minute about this as well. So let's get back over here. And so there's this concept, right, of this river. And there's this idea that there's all of these, let's let's see, let's do it this way. Um, I need all the pins to be blue. Okay. So there's this idea that there is this concept that all of these tributaries connect to this river. Okay. And all of these tributaries connect to those tributaries. So all of these things contribute to the river, right? But this river follows the path of least resistance. I was standing one time on a bridge and I was looking at the river and it was curving around land. That land to me did not merit the river curving around it. The river should have just went right over it, right? Except I don't know what the terrain was when the river began, and I don't know what the terrain was as the river encountered that, but we know that a river follows the path of least resistance. Less dense material versus dense material. Well, it's interesting because when we're working with the premise of logic, we have this idea in our heads that there's only one right way for it to work, right? But then somebody else comes along and invents something that shows that that's not the only one right way. When scientists first had Atlas, which is the largest computer, right, in history, to my knowledge, and it is just a whole bunch of logic gates processing, and you could plug in, I think, 64 numbers is all you could plug into it. And those numbers, of course, could potentially equate to words. It'd be strings, right? But that's what you call it in programming. What text is strings, which is a series of binary on-offs to create letters. Or the idea is that you don't actually ask a computer a question with words. You introduce that word, it interprets it into binary and then does the calculation and then interprets it back into the word answer for you. Okay. But the premise is that this thing would do these calculations, and there's 64 characters altogether, I think is all that it could do. And it was all based upon linear logic. It was based upon on-off binary logic gates. And it was never based upon the idea that there might be some blending. And as AI came along and deep learning came along and neural networks came along, we started to realize that blending played a role. Everyone contributes something to the rest of the world. Every emotion, every thought, or what I should say, imagination, every imagination, every emotion, every physical movement of us, every spiritual process influences everyone else. The idea is that the river itself, you ready for this, is the universe's response to everybody's contribution. And the universe's response to everybody's contribution then becomes what? The will of the universe. So we ask the question, does the will of the universe equate to the will of God? Yahweh tells Moses, he says, I'm going to destroy Israel, and I will raise a nation of Israel up through you Now, we could get into all kinds of stuff why that is true, because remember, Moses screwed up and didn't go into the promised land, right? At least that's what we read in the English. We've had some pretty good midrashes about what that actually means. But the premise is that basically we see Moses not being all that perfect, right? But for some reason, Yahweh wanted to use his DNA to propagate the nation of Israel, the bloodline nation of Israel, right? And he says, no, don't you do that, because the nations of the earth will say he was not able to bring the children of Israel who were in Egypt to the promised land. That's why a remnant had to be preserved, by the way, Caleb and Joshua. There had to be somebody who made it in from that last generation, however wicked they were. It doesn't say a whole lot in terms of choice, but Joshua and Caleb made a choice that day to be strong, courageous, right? But the premise is that Yahweh had an intention, a will that he wanted to, and he is sovereign. There is nothing else telling the intensification what to do, is there? Well, we'll get to that. But the premise is that what we understand is that Moses rejected that will. It wasn't a suggestion. He said, get out of the way. He used an imperative there, not a coercive. He used an imperative. He says, get out of the way. And what? I will destroy them, and I will raise up a nation through you and still be able to fulfill my promise because you are of the sons of Israel. Moses is like, probably shouldn't do that. And so he sways the will of God. Where do we see that also? We see that with David. David says, I'm gonna fast and I'm gonna pray. I'm gonna fight for this kid who's dying, even though that the prophet said that kid's gonna die. David said, I believe it's possible that he could live. And he went to it, and he fought and he fought and he fought and he fought. And we'll accept the sovereignty of Yahweh that child had to die, and there's all kinds of theories on why. But the premise is that David believed he could sway the heart of the intensification of all power in the universe, sway the will. And I propose to you that the world at large has been swaying the will of God for decades, for millennia, and that we are starting to wake up and realize that that's not what we wanted. See, we thought we wanted to be controlled, right? We thought that we wanted to be consoled in our sufferings. You know, one of the biggest things that annoys me about Christianity is the belief that everything's going to get better once you're dead. That drives me crazy. And the reason it does is because it doesn't leave you any room for things to get better now. And it's not what Scripture teaches. And when I say Scripture, I mean it's not what those 66 books teach. So why is this important? Because when we're dealing with attraction, we need to realize that the strongest line is going to attract the strongest information, right? So the premise is that we are now moving in a direction where we are starting to embrace energy again. So now I'm going to share something with you, okay? And this is going to get crazy. But the premise is that we actually have dominion which means what? That the universe is obedient to us, all created things. Psalm chapter 8 says that we were made a little bit lower than Elohim, or if you're in the Septuagint, we were made a little bit lower than the angels. Regardless, it says that everything that has been made is under our feet, okay? Lower than us, right? Now, we could talk about frequency and vibration here, couldn't we? We could, right? But the premise is dominion. The next thing that we have is we have power. What do I mean by power? I mean actual energy. I will get to the what dominion equals for us. And then finally, we have this. Collective conscience or consciousness, collective consciousness, which has something to do with this. Just like the water, okay, let's talk about this for a minute. The water at the top of the mountain, as it's beginning to melt off the snow and trickle into tributaries. The water that was contained, frozen into a solid, now beginning to melt. So going through a change. It's now contributing. What you don't realize is there is a one single connection conduit between that droplet of water that just dripped off of that piece of snow and touched that tributary and that humongous ocean. And there's no separation between them, or there wouldn't be a river. That contribution became a part of the whole. And the whole itself is not linear, which means what? Everybody's individual operation and existence is their own. We all vibrate at a different frequency as if it's a fingerprint. And so in that way, when we get back to the premise of collective consciousness, what you need to realize is whoever is the most dominant in that process is going to be the most influential. When I say the book of Revelation doesn't need to happen, one of the things that you need to realize is it's happening. It's going to happen because we won't do what needs to be done, which is accept that we are the problem. You know, there's an irony to the fact, and I was just telling somebody about this the other day. I said, you know, I get so tired of hearing Christians say, oh, the devil got in my head. And I almost lost my witness. As funny as that sounds, it is ridiculously stupid. Because any theologian will tell you there is no scriptural proof of the devil being omnipresent. So unless you are a really, really, really important person of interest, guess what? Devil didn't get in your head. You got in your head. Right? Well, let's say that we say that the influences and the temptation of the devil were so strong, I just couldn't help it. Not omnipotent. He's not more powerful than you. You can only be persuaded, not defeated. You have to be talked into laying down your sword. You don't lay down. Your sword never gets taken from you. In fact, you don't ever lose the battle. That's already been determined. Don't explain to me how, or don't ask me to explain to you how. But now let's move into this concept then. We'll just go ahead and add that third one, that the devil is not omniscient, doesn't know everything. There's, oh, the devil knows scripture better than you do. Really? Because I can tell you, it's been written upon my heart from the foundations of the earth. Because if Yeshua was slain from the foundations of earth and he sealed us in a new covenant, and that new covenant is that the Torah would be written on our hearts, then guess what? It was written on Adam's heart. That's why Hosea 11 says that Adam violated God's covenant. That's why Paul says that Adam's sin, remember, sin is transgression of Torah. It is very important to understand that we have been given governing principles that promote social justice and that have a force of benefit in our life. There's a reason why we were told not to eat pork. There's a reason why we were told not to covet our neighbor's wife. There's a reason why we were told to take care of the poor, to release the slave. Because in all of that process, we create social justice. But there's another element here that just is totally overlooked, and that is that we each influence the world with our hearts, with our imaginations. As we move down a path, there is another entity moving down that same path in some way. If it's malevolent, then we attract malevolence. If it's benevolent, then we attract benevolence. And when those two become echad, which means there is no other entity, they've joined together. You guys have seen me join the two candles together before. And if I need to illustrate that again sometime, I will. But the premise is that if you take two candles and you join them together, the flame becomes one. And not only does it become one, but I don't know if you guys ever noticed how fast the wax starts dripping because it's more intense. But it becomes one. And as it becomes one, there's no other flame. Now you can pull them back apart because just as much as there's attraction, there's a disattraction or a non-attraction or a repulsion, right? But the premise is that now, if we look at it this way, if we look at it this way, then we can understand that this is the will. This is swaying the heart of God in some direction. We don't know what, because that part is kind of above our pay grade, but we know that each heart is contributing to it. So there's two things that are very important. If you want the book of Revelation to happen, just keep wanting that because it's coming. But if you would actually like to understand why Yeshua came and died, because if he came and died, and that gave us an opportunity to change, then he believed in us enough to change. He trusted us with change. And we don't have to destroy ourselves. We don't have to become this false bride. We don't have to become the counterfeit and just become this state of destruction that needs this flushing, and therefore the world will be destroyed. You say, well, what about the new heavens and new earth? Why does it have to be destroyed for it to become new? Why can't we become the new heavens and the new earth? You say, oh, that flies in the face of everything that would be the sovereignty of God. No, it doesn't. It just makes us a participant instead of a bystander, which is what Christians are today. They're bystanders. Oh, the will of God. Yeah, tell that to Peter, who went and healed the guy in the temple, if he got into the will of God. Don't get me wrong. I think it was activated like a transistor, and I think it was amplified like a transistor. But I can tell you that that presupposes that he had a desire or a racham, a compassion for the man in the first place. Remember what I said about judgment. Remember what I said that God put the human element in so that there was compassion on the guilty, right? Yeshua was acquainted with our grief. And somehow, through both the all-knowing element of being slain from the foundations of the earth and entering into a body and becoming that slainness, he compassionately was willing to take that and do that. He made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. The Torah became flesh and dwelt among us, right? In the beginning was the Torah, and the Torah was with God, and the Torah was God, right? So in that premise, what we are working with is that we need to begin to allow things to be in existence with us, just like with the river, right? Because here's something interesting about this. Can you resist this? Can you stop this from happening? Because you're just one influence. And do that in a different color. You are one single influence coming into this tributary. And guess what? If you are not for it, then you are against it. And who has ever tried to swim upstream in a river? If you tried, you know. This is not easy. This is not an easy task, especially when everybody else is moving in that direction. So what does that mean? That means that we need to begin to contribute the new paths that we experience by teaching them to others. Because now what we begin to realize is that if they're doing what's right in their own eyes and not having Torah govern them, then we understand that this concept is off. Now, earlier I talked about modeling, and the premise behind modeling is to take something that's successful and apply it in the same way, right? And so we go and we look at how Edison developed a light bulb, and we realize that's a model. There's a choice that we have to make, that if it doesn't work, we try a different way. We don't give up. He didn't give up. What was it, 1,000 light bulbs? Right? Don't get me wrong. I can't stand Edison. I think he's an evil dude. But he tried 1,000 times, and that model works. Because why? We have a light bulb, right? And so the premise is that if that's true, then we should use it, right? So now we come to something interesting. Because there's a sentiment in Christianity that if something is used to heal somebody and it's not conforming to the belief of a Christian about what we think we understand about Christ and about truth and about energy and about other things, that it is somehow condemnable, right? Remember our blockchain logic that we need to develop, where we say, oh, if something's working, let's use it, right? So now all of a sudden we have these modalities, right? These alternative medicine modalities, or we have these ideas that people come up with, and they go to their pastor and they're like, well, what if this is actually what Christ meant? And the pastor's like, oh no, this is what it meant. You can't say that's actually, you need to be careful with that. In fact, you know what? I actually want you to come to my apologetics class, and I want you to learn, because you're kind of getting out there. Or somebody will come and say, hey, you know what? Such and such said this. And the pastor would be like, oh, no, that's dangerous. Don't do that. Where and at what time did God become untrustworthy in his willingness to protect us from that which is malevolent? But one of our issues that we have is that we have the nerve to think that because the river is flowing in that direction, that it's the will of God, when it is very apparent that humans influence the will of God. I'm about to share that. Okay, so there's this concept in Hebrew. And actually the way that I'm going to do this, and then this is the actual final part right here. Okay. Let's see, we're going to actually go here. Nope, that's not where I want to be. This is where I want to be. Okay. So I'm going to go over to Psalms 118. Okay. And there's a reason why I'm doing this. In Psalm 118:25, a word is used, okay? And that's this word right here, which is what? This is Hoshiana. Hoshia, Hoshiana, okay? So here's the Hoshia part, right? Which is what Joshua's name was before his name was Joshua. But Hoshia, which is what? It is imperative. Let's talk a minute about imperative. What is imperative? Let's take a look. Culturally, right? We're talking about culturally here. Used to issue a command in the second person. That is, the command is directed at the person being spoken to. Hebrew imperatives agree in gender and number with those at whom they are directed. Okay. But then we see something else. We see that's in the Hifil. What's the Hifil? The Hifil expresses a causative action. Okay. Then we can say, well, it's coming from what? Yasha. Oh, goodness. Here we are back at the destroyer, right? The destroyer watches. The name of Yeshua, right? Yasha. What does Yasha mean? To save. No, it means to snatch a sheep out of a wolf's mouth violently, right? To deliver violently, to be victorious in battle. Yep, that's pretty good right there, right? But now watch this. Going back to our word, we know it's in the imperative. Who's saying it? I'll tell you who's saying it here in a minute. But then we have this word na, which is a particle used in Hebrew. And very specifically, this particle means I acknowledge your authority, but do it now. Okay? So basically, it is a way to give a command to somebody in authority. Okay? In Hebrew. Now, does that change the sovereignty of that authority? No, it does not. That authority can say, you better go find something to do because you're messing with me. I'm going to crush you. I'm going to squash like grape, right? But the premise is that Na says, I acknowledge your authority, but do this now. I acknowledge your sovereignty. I accept that this is your will, but do this now. It is built into the grammar of Hebrew, okay? Now, watch this. This altogether, from here to here, is Hoshiana. Sound familiar? It's Hosanna. Now, let's talk a minute about that. Where do we get Hosanna? We get Hosanna on the triumphal entry, right? The day of the watch of the Lamb, the day that the Lamb is supposed to be brought into the house to watch and make sure that it is without blemish, is the day that Yeshua is coming into Jerusalem. And as he's coming into Jerusalem, people are putting their palm fronds on the ground, laying their jackets on the ground, and they're yelling, Hosanna to the Son of David. What are they saying? Violently deliver us now. We acknowledge your authority, but now. So if it's built into the Hebrew grammar, and watch I'm going to get at here. It's built into the Hebrew grammar to be able to give commands to an authority, which has to do with equilibrium. Right? Remember, they took up stones to stone Yeshua. They took up stones to kill him, to stone Yeshua. Right? Because he was making himself equal with God. Do you know there's emendations of the scribes where the scribes changed the Torah in Genesis chapter 18 because it appeared as though Abraham was talking to God with authority. They changed the grammar. It's called the emendations of the scribes, and it's one of the laws of the Sopharim. It's one of the rules of the children of the writers of Torah. When they learn, when they train, when the students train to write Torah, they are taught the emendations. And they take up stones to stone Yeshua, and they say, you make yourself equal with God. Right? Now watch this. They say, do you hear what these people are saying? Tell them to be quiet. And what does he say? If I was to silence them, the very rocks would cry out the same thing. If you understood what that really meant, your mind would be blown. But I can tell you the premise is that the will of God can be swayed, and that it's being swayed by the behavior, choices, and actions of human beings as the universe answers dominion. Romans says that it was subjected until there would be what? A revealing of the sons of God. Remember, sons of Adam control and what? Rule the kingdom of earth. But the sons of God control and rule the kingdom of heaven. And all creation is waiting with birth pains until now. And that was in Romans. Until now, for the revealing of the sons of God and their glory. I'm not even going to get into that today. But the premise is that creation has been waiting for us to do this, to wake up, to use dominion correctly, to use power correctly. Now, I don't completely understand power yet, but I do know that Yeshua walks out onto in a storm, onto water, in the middle of a storm, a sea, right? The Sea of Galilee. And they go, and he quiets the water, right? Or maybe it's when he woke up in the boat. I can't remember. But either way, he quiets the water, and they say, what manner of man is this, that even the waves and the wind obey him? And he says, why do you marvel? Greater works than this shall you do. Okay, do me a favor. This is what I want you to do. I want you to go, and I want you to go to the ocean. I want you to rent a sailboat, go out and aim it towards a storm, get into that storm, and hush the waters and the wind, because it said greater works than that would those disciples do. So now either those disciples were empowered with something and that's it, it's done, or we are way off. And if we are way off, then we are not modeling correctly. I'm going to prove that to you. What's the first thing that Yeshua would do when he'd go into a city? He would heal. Then he would speak the gospel of the kingdom, which had something to do with being within you, which has something to do with Elohim, has something to do with a strong mind, has something to do with all the other parables that he talked about the kingdom of heaven. And so from that premise, then we need to accept that we are way off in what we've been doing. When we are sending priests to the end of the earth, to some indigenous nation, and trying to convince them that they need to become white cultural Christians, when that's not the model that Yeshua did. And that's not the model that he taught his disciples. Heal first, then preach the gospel. We're not even carrying out the model, more or less actually doing it, because, again, where's the healing? We've got a load of evangelists out there. So if we're not even modeling correctly, and remember, we have to take the thing that's successful and then give it to others, right? If we're not even modeling correctly, then we're never, ever going to arrive at the place where we need to arrive. Why is that? Because of linear logic. Because we are still thinking like Greeks, instead of like these super minds that are in these computers that are out thinking us. It should not be that way. We are way more capable of a computer. But the problem is that we're just trying to make this connection to this connection to this connection, and the AI is going answer. And the stuff that we could do with the Hebrew, the stuff that we could do with the cultural understanding of that, the grammar itself, the na in and of itself says that that is possible. Now, don't get me wrong. Yahweh's sovereign. And if he doesn't like your mouth, they don't care. But if it's something that has to do with swaying the will of God for the benefit of humanity, boy, we better try, right? We better try. Because what is true about that single mind that's got that blockchain going on, that block logic going on, is it's moving in a direction of something we call singularity. And that premise is that there will be a point in time where all of the internet will be one single mind in understanding. Why? Because that's what humanity is moving towards, and the proof is in this illustration right here. The false bride. The corporate collective conscience that had to be interfered with because nothing was impossible for them. A model that we can apply to the bride. You want nothing to be impossible for you? We need to become a corporate collective conscience of vibrational agreement, not doctrinal agreement. Come on. Does everybody really have to like the color red in order to be saved? No, I don't think so. But you sure better be able to vibrate with a positive interaction with somebody who likes the color red if you don't, or vice versa. Purple, green, blue, doesn't matter. The premise is that disunity is a result of the fact that there is what? Repulsion or disattraction. We need to start moving vibrationally through to create that magnetic force, those magnetic fields that creates that force. That is an illustration of what is actually going on in the spiritual. Resist the devil and he will flee from you. That's repulsion, right? Humble yourself in the sight of the Lord and he will raise you up to a position of honor, right? Because why? Because you're aligning with the Lord. Why does it say that? Draw near to God and he will draw near to you. Law of attraction. Come on, people. And in that same verse, it tells you to wash your hands, which is tome, the container of water, which is kind of full circle, but not. So what's my point? My point behind all of this is that instead of being afraid of this technology, in fact, in general, instead of being afraid of technology, which you are, I know you are. I mean, people all the time, I don't really know computers, and it's time to start using QR codes and apps and all those things and to just get over it. Just like when the telephone was invented, just like when the TV was invented. Come on, 1950s, there was a TV in every house. But what was it before that? There was a radio in every house, right? The premise is that we are progressing, but the reason we are is because of what we actually want to be. Humanity is trying to show itself who we really are and how powerful we really are and what that means. Because perhaps maybe it's not this world that needs fixed. Maybe we need to unite first, and then there's something that needs to be fixed that's even bigger that we don't understand yet because we're still trying to figure this out. Because we are trying to continue to say, I mean, well, the day will not come soon enough when a theology school will actually consider the possibility that Luther was wrong about some things, or that Calvin was wrong about some things. Now, there are those who say, oh, he's unlearned. Oh, he doesn't have a complete understanding of theology. Oh, he doesn't have this, he doesn't have that. But I can tell you what I have done and what I see is that there are models in place, not only from what we have made, but what was created. And those things that were created are telling us a story. And one of the simplest things that I can see in all of it is that they were given an instruction to grow like a plant and to act like a plant and to be a plant. And we were given instruction to be gods and to act like gods. And somewhere along the lines, we're going to have to get over that fact and let that go because Yeshua said it. Yeshua said, is it not written, you were all gods? And the scripture can't be broken. The graphe, the writings can't be broken. Why? Because that is in the Psalms, which is the writings. But the premise is that all of this has to do with an idea that somewhere along the lines, you've just got to stop. Stop thinking about how fair or unfair it is that this person is not changing. And start thinking about how fair or unfair it is that you're not changing. This world needs changed. I said something last week, I think it was, where I would apologize to people for Christianity. I would say this religion is sick, but the teachings are sound. Yeshua had a process or a purpose. Now, here's a question. If you can't swim upstream, which you can't, how do you nudge the rest of the world? Well, the premise is obviously you can't just walk up to somebody and tell them they're wrong. I've tried that. I've walked up to a Christian and said, you're a pig-eating sun worshiper, and I can tell you that all of the things that you practice are pagan, and that you have no concept or idea of what the first century church was. That got me in a fight, right? And I've gone up to people and just tolerated them, and that just made me resentful and anguish myself. But when I began to say, why would Yeshua say this? And why would this happen and we don't practice it? Or why would Paul say this and we don't practice it? When Paul supposedly altered the doctrine, right? Paul supposedly established the doctrine of Christianity, when the truth is he was a rabbi. He may have been altering Judaism, but that was a sect of Judaism. In other words, he modeled Judaism and then introduced the things that didn't work, removed the things that didn't work, and introduced new things into it. That's what I should have said. So the premise is that there's a passiveness, right? Yeshua says, blessed are the merciful. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Blessed are those, right? He says, feed your enemies. He says, turn the other cheek. There's a passiveness to this. And that passiveness has to do with your influence upon the rest of the world through the change that you become. Because I'm going to share something with you. You won't be able to keep your mouth shut when you change. When you change, you want to tell everybody that you've changed. That's why Yeshua said, the kingdom of heaven is like unto the person who finds the treasure in the field. And he goes and sells everything he has so that he can buy that field and so he can have the treasure. Once change occurs, right, there's an explosion of abundance, of desire to help people not have to suffer the way that you're suffering. Remember, your adversity becomes your strength becomes your expertise becomes your purpose. And so in that way, becoming the change, instead of blaming somebody else, instead of believing that your way is the only possible direction that Christianity could go, and allowing to see what actually flows. Because I will propose to you that if the river is influencing the will of God towards revelation, which is destruction, then I will propose to you that it's not something that he sovereignly wants to keep in a state, which means it's swayable, which means it's changeable, which means it's alterable. And if it's alterable, then we need to understand that there are things we don't understand, but that we will understand. That was what I said at the beginning of this Torah cycle. I was like, guys, we're going to have to end the Midrash today because I have no idea what this means. And what we're doing is just spinning our wheels. We don't know yet what it means. but somehow the strong mind has something to do with the light. And Yeshua said, you are the strong minds of the world. Go ye forth, right? Let your light shine amongst men. Let your strong mind influence and therefore become the change. Do I know why it's broken? No, but I know we have to fix it. And I know that us having to fix it gives us purpose. And it's a unique purpose because we all vibrate at a different frequency. We all have some unique difference in our frequency. But the premise is that somehow, some way, all of those work together in a harmonious way. And when they do, there's only an external entity can alter it. And that's not always necessary, just so you know, that aloneness. So the premise then is that we need to find the correct unity, because what the devil seeks to do, and I'm not defining the devil for you today, because I can tell you it's not what you think it is. But what the devil seeks to do is unseat your dominion. Remember, you can be persuaded, not defeated. Unseat your power. Remember that you actually are an energy being with the ability to move and process energy and intensify it through that transistor concept to affect change and to counterfeit the corporate collective conscience. That is why this is so important, because when it says the dragon went off to make war with the sons of the woman. Now, we don't know what the woman is, but the sons of the woman who have the testimony of Yeshua and the commandments of God, we know we are missing something from our walk today. And in that process, the dragon is being successful. Book of Revelation is right on schedule, and that's going to be that. Now, when we finally get the Genesis in the Image of God series out, you will see a different perspective on what is supposed to happen in the 6,000th year of creation. And I can tell you, it's not what the book of Revelation is saying. It's something else. And the consequence of not doing it is what the book of Revelation is. And remember, the people were given a chance to repent. They were given a chance don't get me wrong, there was a point of no return. There was a point of no return for Israel and those 10 tribes who are lost. And there was a point of no return for Judah and the Babylonian exile, which consequently brings up Babylon again. But the premise is that there was a point of no return. But before that, there were warnings and there were discussions and there were attempts to have mercy. That's proven in Ahab, right? Where the one prophet says, there's a spirit, a lying tongue in the mouth of the prophets. And I alone am speaking the truth. And every prophet went by and slapped him and said, which way that spirit go? There's always a mercy, because that is the first and primary emanation of God. And any information that's going back up the pipe to the intensification of all power in the universe is passing through that filter. So what is the point of this message? The point of this message is everything that has been made teaches us about the eternal power, divine nature, and invisible attributes of God, of the intensification of all power in the universe and all of the variations of that to cause us to have an understanding. Because we cannot, with our finite minds, process the intensification of all power in the universe. The premise is that we need to realize that everything that's created, everything that we make is tending towards what we actually are supposed to be and become. The spiritual evolution that needs to occur in humanity is occurring in technology right now. From the transistor all the way to deep mind. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is we're dealing with a counterfeit again. But the reason we are is because of what truly needs to be. Because we're all tending towards homeostasis, hydrostatic equilibrium, and harmonic vibration. We're all tending towards those things. We are not on some road to hell because we're all evil. That is not what was meant in Genesis 8. There's way too much compassion in the intensification of all power in the universe to give us 75 years to figure out how to change. We need to influence the next generation by becoming that change. And that is going to require an open mind, because we're going to have to throw out the traditions. We're going to have to throw out the dogma. We're going to have to throw out the stuff. We're going to have to look at the data. We're going to have to look at the information. We're going to have to look back to a man who it was accounted to righteousness that he believed God. And we know that that righteousness could only have come through the merit of Yeshua. And that man was a Chaldean, magician, a Chasdim. Something about Abraham intrigued Paul enough to say that he was the father of all who believe, both circumcised and uncircumcised. He was trying to say that there's something that Abraham did, led, and understood that we are losing touch with because he brought it up. We have got to let go of the biases, and we've got to let go of the dogma, and we've got to let go of the doctrines, and we have to accept that it's very, very possible that we were wrong, and it's very, very possible that we are misinterpreting Scripture, and we need to go back to the beginning. We need to go look at those pottery shards and ask, why would they draw a human head and an ox's head for the word light? Why would they draw a rope and a human head for evil? Why would they draw a container and water for uncleanness? Unless maybe we're not putting the right words in there. And if we're not, then huge doctrines are based upon the information. And I, for one, don't want to be wrong anymore, because I can tell you, I don't want to die and not see some semblance of the book of Acts. In fact, I will add to my list. There are 3 things that scare me in Scripture. One is tehom, which is the abyss, because the understanding of it has been lost, and we think we know what it means, but we don't know what it means. Okay, tehom. That's where it says, "And darkness was over the face of the deep," right? Number 2 is sulam, which is basically the word for ladder when it talks about Jacob's ladder. Number 3 is the word dust. But I'm going to add to that concept that I'm afraid that I'm going to die and not see a modeling of the first century church. Prove me wrong. For those of you who are on YouTube, I will go ahead and say Shabbat Shalom. For those of you who are staying, we'll move into the Midrash. Shabbat